Welcome to the SBI Podcast, offering CEOs, sales and marketing leaders ideas to make the number.
Welcome SBI listeners, readers, and viewers. My name is Greg Alexander, and I am the CEO of SBI, a management consulting firm specializing in sales and marketing, dedicated to helping you make your number. This is the weekly SBI podcast, and its purpose is to help you make your number by getting your peers to share with you how they make theirs. Today's guest is Mark Roberts, and he is the Chief Marketing Officer at ShoreTel, a leading provider of brilliantly simple IP phone systems and unified communications, powering today's always-on workforce. Love that description. Mark, welcome to the show.
Hey, Greg, how are you?
All right. Okay, today's topic is critical success factors for new CMOs. Get this, about a quarter of all B2B companies have a CMO who's been on the job for 1 year or less. These leaders face similar challenges and opportunities in those critical first few months, and how new CMOs manage these transitions can make the difference between success and failure. Mark took the CMO job at ShoreTel at the very end of 2013 and has spent the last 2.5 years overcoming the challenges new CMOs face. And I wanted him to share these with you. So if you are a new CMO, you kind of understand what good looks like. We're going to use SBI's revenue growth method to make this happen, and specifically pages 111 to 152, which discusses marketing strategy. If you want to follow along at home, get a copy at salesbenchmarkindex.com/2016-report. Mark, I would like to begin our dialogue by discussing what you did with the brand, campaigns, budget, and analytics. So my first question is, did you rebrand ShoreTel, and if so, why?
You know, this is one of these, in coming in, I thought long and hard on this particular topic and did all of the usual brand studies, trying to understand the asset, the liability that I had. And really explored several options, but it came back down to the essence of the ShoreTel brand was just right for where we were in our trajectory. And having gone through all of those studies and explored the varying options, I've come to look upon this, being the brilliantly simple guys as a gift. It was a great start, something that we could build upon quite easily. But what I did do was took a good hard look at the attributes associated with that. And then we developed strategies to really reinforce what essentially had just become a throwaway tagline. Somewhere along that way, we'd really got away from that being brilliantly simple. And so the last couple of years, 2.5 years, has really been about getting the organization back to true north, where the North Star really was, and building on those attributes that really reinforce that concept of being brilliantly simple, not only in the minds of our customers, but also in the minds of our employees as well. Essentially living that brand.
Yeah, it's a great answer. It really is, because many times new CMOs, which is what this show is about, they come in and they want to redo the brand. They do all the studies that you did, and unfortunately, sometimes they feel as if they need to put their fingerprints on something, so they rebrand for the sake of rebranding. What I love about your answer is you didn't do that. You thought the brand was right for where you were, but you wanted to get everybody back to message, if you will, and reinforce the brilliantly simple concept. So that took a lot of courage to do that. It took some maturity. And for those listening or watching or reading this, be careful. Don't just rebrand for the sake of it. Take your time and do your study, but make sure that if you're going to rebrand, which is a big initiative, it better be worth it.
It's kind of that old cliche, Greg. You come in and, hey, we got a new CMO. Where's the new PowerPoint template, and what are we going to call ourselves going forward? The temptation to do that, you're absolutely right. It's immense because you were brought there to do something. What are you going to do? Right.
Yeah, exactly. Let's talk about the campaign process. So you got through the branding. Did you redesign the campaign process, and if so, how?
This was one of the early areas of intense focus. So I did. I completely looked at the campaign process from start to finish. A little bit of a background. It was incredibly fragmented here. I actually had little agreement on what the word campaign meant. And so we had to get all the way back to, look, can we even get a common vernacular of when we're talking about a campaign, what do we really mean? Now, this complication really came from acquisitions that we'd made that hadn't been fully integrated. And We had some lingering behavior based upon some firm personal beliefs. And that was really focusing the activity rather than being focused on the objective of the campaign or, more importantly, a customer. But I think those are some of the most difficult issues to address as they become, they're organizational and belief-based by nature. But in working through that and looking at the overall campaign structure, how it should flow, and getting a common understanding of what we were trying to achieve, it somewhat drove structure too.
So you did a bunch of acquisitions. People were confusing activities with campaigns. So you started out by grounding everybody on what an actual campaign was, and then started launching campaigns. Was that the sequence?
Yeah, pretty much. With the one caveat that I'm not necessarily sure that there was a complete misunderstanding about or a belief about what a campaign was. It was more territorial by nature. Oh. It was the lingering effects of acquisitions that had taken place where I was almost dealing with fiefdoms. The campaign structure and process and overall outreach, go-to-market, that was just being hampered by fiefdoms. And it was almost an organizational problem, not necessarily a campaign problem. But looking at the campaign structure really bubbled that to the surface.
Okay, got it. That's good clarification. All right, let's move to the budget. So did you alter the budget and or the budgeting process itself? And if so, why?
For me, the budgeting process, that represents, in a marketing organization, just to clarify, that represents probably the most visible representation of the overall marketing strategy. Mm-hmm. And based on the approach that we'd taken in reaching out to the customer previously, I was looking at many very different buckets of spending. Much of it was duplicated. None of it was considering other activities in the organization. And stepping back from it, I essentially had two brands that were out there and several different buckets of budget that were supporting different interpretations of those brands. So we quickly shifted from the isolated budgets and the pocket veto approach to total transparency. Got everybody in a room, stuck the entire number up on the screen, and went through which activities we felt were important, which activities would be good to do, and which were superfluous to the longer-term goal of actually driving demand. And it was amazing how quickly that pocket veto disappeared, because you've then got that trust that's built and it's based upon a shared common goal rather than defending a perceived it's my budget and I have to defend this part of it. This is where my power lays. The power laid in driving the entire company forward and growth.
Yeah. I love getting everybody in the room, putting it up on a screen, unpacking the number and attacking the pocket veto. That's a great visual. I've been in some of those meetings and I agree with you. There's a very effective way to do that, especially if you're a new CMO. That might be, item number one to jump into.
I gotta confess, it's not the most popular thing you can do day one of your tenure. No. But for me, that was probably one of the more productive, unpleasant exercises that we had to go through early. Now, I'm not suggesting we don't have room for improvement in that area, but the friction, you could feel it almost dissipating over those weeks. And it's fair to point out that not everybody made that journey with us, but we did retain the majority of the talent. Looking back on it, we retained the talent that we needed, and it immediately shifted that. The friction is the best way I can describe it, just dissipated, and you start to build on that trust because you can see what the other groups are actually doing.
Yep. All right, we're talking to Mark Roberts, CMO at ShoreTel, and we're having a conversation today around the critical success factors for new CMOs. And Mark has been with ShoreTel for 2.5 years, went in there and did quite a few things and has made it past that honeymoon period, so to speak. We're learning from him today some things that you may want to talk about. We discussed brands, we discussed campaigns, we discussed budgets. Mark, I've been around you for a while, and you always struck me as a CMO that was analytical in nature and data-driven. So when you went over to ShoreTel, did you implement analytics, and if so, how come?
Yeah, you know me reasonably well for that. This was my first stop after the budget. And it was for me, it was an interesting journey because when I looked around the organization, there was little and no consistency in terms of data sets, what the data meant, or frankly, even what a customer was. I had a few different marketing automation platforms, 3 or 4 different instances of the same CRM platform, and no consistency of data. Very little on Google Analytics that anybody believed. So we were looking at it, just the common comment in any meeting was, yes, but is that accurate? And I've discovered in talking to my peers that this is not an unusual scenario, that this issue is consistent. So I get into a set of analytics that you can believe, even if you know they're not 100% accurate, for me is just critical. And I kind of take the pragmatic view of, look, the data's important, and it can show where you're going directionally, but it's those well-trained opinions that really count. It's those individuals that you've got in the room that can actually make the assessment based on the data. Because it's never going to be 100% accurate. And frankly, if it was and it showed the obvious route forward, why would we be in the room? You could automate this kind of activity. So it's that analysis and the ability to look through the questionable data, place the customer back at the center of that thinking, don't blindly follow, and making the right decisions for the business to grow rather than defending a specific area. And that's for me, is kind of the important part, Greg. It's that shift over to what's the objective of looking at this data. And it's not to defend a particular segment of the marketing activity. It's to try and figure out how to actually grow the business.
Very helpful. We need to take a quick break. You're listening to the SBI podcast.
Each day, you receive hundreds of emails, tons of text messages, countless telephone calls, and sit in too many meetings. How do you find ideas to make the number with all this noise? The SBI blog filters all this nonsense for you and presents only first-rate ideas to make the number. Simplify your life. Subscribe to one blog and read the best content. Go to salesbenchmarkindex.com and subscribe today.
Welcome back. My name is Greg Alexander, and I am the CEO of SBI. And my guest today is Mark Roberts, the CMO at ShoreTel. Today we are discussing the critical success factors for a new CMO. And we're using SBI's revenue growth methodology to do it, specifically pages 111 and 152. If you want a copy, go to salesbenchmarkindex.com/2016 report. Before the break, Mark and I discussed branding, campaign design, budgeting, and analytics. During this segment, we're going to discuss the marketing org chart. So, Mark, did you reorg the marketing department? And if so, why did you do that?
Yeah, I did reorg, and I did so out of necessity. The model that we had prior to me joining was very much aligned around product manufacturing approach and then a cloud group. And I distinguish the difference between the two as if you're looking at a typical product and manufacturing, we're very used to developing something, keeping it under wraps, and then on a certain day, big launch, pull the covers off it, ta-da, come get my product, and all the activities necessary to do that. With a cloud, a services approach, it's not. It's incremental, and you're looking at a service that's being sold, not necessarily a product approach. And those are very, very different philosophies from a marketing perspective. And all of this was taking place without any formal divisions in place, either product divisions inside the company, so either within the company or a division within the mind of the customer. They were still approaching us for communications, and yet we were approaching them with a very, very different set of messages. So I adopted a traditional shared service approach for some areas, but we really focused on the demand generation center. And this was the big shift and placing emphasis on how much marketing was actually contributing to revenue. Not leads or impressions, but revenue. And if you stop anyone in the marketing group and say, hey, how are we doing? 80% of them will be able to tell you exactly where we are in terms of contribution to revenue in any given quarter. That's how focused we are on it. Now, this focused the organizational design on what and how we could achieve. An important aspect of this for me was really getting away from that the traditional, if that's a term I can use for a marketing qualified lead, that traditional handover to sales as if that was our job and it's done. I see our role as much more integrated into the buyer's process, and that simple handover of a lead that just wasn't doing it for us. So we needed to make sure that we had the skill set was available and it existed to execute on that vision. And that was formative in deciding upon the structure and the kind of individuals and skill set that we needed.
It's an interesting conversation that you just brought up, or before and after comparison point. So you've got this kind of traditional manufacturing, product-driven approach, with a heavy focus as it relates to marketing around the launch. And then you switch to a services business, delivering your solution via the cloud. And, totally different approach altogether. And that's what caused you to go from the old org model to the new model and focus on demand generation all the way through the revenue cycle. So within demand generation itself, right, because that's a big term, describe a little bit about, how the organization is set up. What types of roles do you have on your org chart, et cetera?
Yeah, so looking at the probably one of the key areas that it's all built around is the content operations. There's the entire idea of how you're going to reach out to somebody and start a conversation and build a conversation and keep it going. The content and what you're doing from that aspect is just foundational. Mm-hmm. The rest of the organization is then built around typical SEO, SEM, paid, etc. But it's really focused on building that journey, that story that will take a buyer right from the start, from the early inception, all the way through down to a closed sale, rather than just focused on that top, let's fill the top of the pipeline. And so I probably reach a lot further down with the titles that I have in the marketing group, a lot further down the buyer's journey than you would in a typical marketing organization.
Yeah.
And as an example, the content team work very, very closely with sales all the way down to what's required to get somebody over the line in terms of committing, handing over an order. Whereas typically, certainly in talking to my peers, that level of responsibility seems to stop at filling the top of that funnel, that pipeline. Mm-hmm. So my titles probably look somewhat similar to an average organization, but the responsibility we push much, much further down the buyer's journey than I've seen some of my peers do.
Yeah. What I love about your answer is the fundamental design principle was working backwards from the buyer's journey, and it was grounded in the creation of high quality and high relevant content at the top, middle, and bottom of the funnel, right? So it's just a fantastic piece of advice, and it's refreshing to hear. So for the new...
It's critical, Greg. Yeah. And being somewhat parochial about this, we have the unusual scenario, at the risk of delving into a sales pitch here, the short-held proposition is, look, we do product and we do cloud, and it's a mix and match of the two. So the content required to keep that conversation going and to enable that assessment almost in an independent fashion, it's significant, and it's required us to look at it very, very differently.
Yeah, I agree. So for you new CMOs that want to follow Mark's success story, when you're looking at doing a reorg, make sure you know the buyer's journey, not just your piece of it, the entire thing, and make sure you've got a content organization set up that you can produce this content and work successfully with sales to bring orders across the line. All right, so you got this new org model, right? So now you've got people in jobs, and they might be doing things in their jobs they've never done before. So how did you assess the talent on your team?
I've used a variety of tools over the years to do this, and I've come to the opinion that it really doesn't matter which one you use, provided you're consistent and the team understand why you're trying to do it. I think there are many different ways to assess the talent. We went outside for these tools. We didn't look towards necessarily the HR group for what we were using currently, although we did engage HR to go through this exercise. And I settled on something called Strength Finder. And the reality was we only did this to provide a common language to understand how the various team members thought about things and where they had varying strengths. But recently, and by the way, I'm not advocating for any of these tools specifically, but recently we used Bergman as well. Mm-hmm. And from this particular tool, there was something of an epiphany. It became clear, although it's obvious in hindsight, and we all know this, that not everybody processes ideas at the same pace, but probably more importantly, in the same way. And using this tool, it gave us the ability to look at individuals' natural preference for ideation, or whether they focused on process, or whether they like to influence and sell ideas throughout the organization, or whether they were routed in action. They just wanted to do things. And so by getting almost a map of the preferred working style of the individuals, the key individuals in the organization, it gave us an easier way to see when you're in that meeting and you're saying, look, here's where we're going to go, and you've got one person in the room that's saying, yes, but what are we going to do? And you're thinking, we're not even at that stage yet. I'm just going through the early stages of it, and yet they're all the way at the end wanting to know what to do next. And it was that concept of, look, not everybody operates in the same zone. They don't think about things the same way. That was really that epiphany. And so with the organization now and using these tools, I try to make sure that right from the start, we bring people through that process of, look, what's the idea? What's the concept? What are the processes that are needed? Where do we need to get influence inside the organization? And then what's the action, the final things that we need to do to actually go and make that happen? And you got to bring everybody along at the same route. Yep. And for me, that kind of explained that I'm stood in front of the organization and I'm describing the objective that we're going to go after, and here I am running up the hill and explaining this is where we're headed, and yet the rest of the group just aren't with you. And it takes the next couple of months to really try and figure out how to get everybody on the same page and get agreement and consensus that this is the right direction. Yep. And again, for me, that explained a lot of the that friction and resistance that people had to change. I think that people are okay with change, provided they're involved in the change.
Yep, for sure. Okay, so you took the time to assess your team, which is great. You're trying to implement change, so understanding how people process change is a key thing. After you go through these assessments, you have a pretty good understanding of the capabilities of your team, and there may be some gaps. And normally in that situation, you fill those gaps by engaging with specialty agencies that have the skills that you need. Did you do that? Did you engage with agencies to extend the capabilities of your team?
We did. I didn't necessarily look upon it as filling gaps. It was more about building out capabilities where we probably had some capability but needed more, and the exceptions being PR, et cetera, which is a standard, obvious extension. Started with a full agency review, but doesn't every CMO, and you get the new PowerPoint template that comes with it. But I was looking at it from the perspective of, could we actually work together? And one of the changes after we went through this agency review, and we did swap out a couple of agencies, we instituted a working group that includes every agency, much the same as we do for internal issues. And now so I literally get everybody in the room once a quarter to cover strategy progress, execution against objectives. And I found having all the smart people in one room, it's been very, very, very energizing for the collective team. But it's also yielded some great synergies, such as campaign flow, performance progress. I don't think that we would have got there taking a traditional sequential approach of, look, demand gen sits over there and they deal with their agencies. PR is over there, deals with their creative appears when we need it. I get them all in the same room.
Yeah.
It's been very, very enlightening.
Yeah, I love the idea. I've tried to do it myself, but I got to tell you, I have failed, and here's why. You get all these agencies in the room, and they're all doing specific things for you, but they're all trying to grow their business with you, and then they start fighting over the pie. So, hey, I do this, and I also do that, and next thing you know, they view themselves as competitors, and it can be difficult at times getting them to stay focused on the immediate task at hand. So how have you kind of refereed the boxing match between agencies?
I think you've got to get the right agency for you to begin with. And for me, instead of doing the typical RFP beauty show approach, we were looking at agencies not only for the capabilities, but for a cultural a fit. And for me, it's much more of a cultural thing than it is capabilities, clients lists, references, etc. It's, can you see this person being an extended part of the team? Yeah. And are they prepared to behave in that way? And I use person instead of company specifically. Yeah. Agencies are made up as individuals, as we all know. But it's those individuals that you're going to be working with day in, day out. And can you see yourself just interacting with them day out? And can you see them interacting with the rest of the organization day in, day out? Yeah. The rest of the organization being the other agencies that are there. And we made some fairly tough decisions based on agencies that ostensibly look like a perfect fit for us, and yet I just couldn't see that dynamic happening. I thought I would end up in the scenario that you've just described at some point.
Yep.
And we make the budgets somewhat transparent, not to the point where we're doing profitability, etc., but people know what's being spent where, and it removes a lot of that debate. Yeah. It's uncomfortable, somewhat unconventional. Had complaints from some of the agencies as to the approach that we were taking, but made it a prerequisite of doing business with us, and it yielded results.
Yeah. Okay, so you go through this process of getting rid of some agencies, bringing on new agencies, managing these agencies differently, getting them to cooperate with one another. Some of the CMOs that are listening to this struggle with starting up a new agency relationship. So once you make the selection, you've got to get them productive quickly. So what recommendations do you have for our audience on starting up a new agency relationship?
I think for me this is the toughest area, and this is where, first and foremost, there's a degree of transparency and honesty that both sides need to have as to the expectations of the actual relationship itself. The RFP is one thing, but laying out how it's going to work long term, that's totally another. And once you've gone through the beauty show and it's all kind of settled down, you got to get into that. What's the cadence? What are the expectations that are required from any specific agency? But more importantly, it's the amount of work that's required internally. My advice would be don't underestimate that. Like any new relationship, whether this just happens to be on an agency, but whether it's a channel partner or a customer, it requires a huge amount of effort to get the thing going in the first instance. Don't underestimate the resources and don't underinvest in it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. If you're a new CMO and you're listening to this, you're just taking over a new job, you're onboarding new agencies, ask yourself this question first, or maybe ask this of your agencies. What does it mean to be a good client? I mean, its relationship is bidirectional, and the agency is going to be dependent upon you for certain things. And if you don't fulfill your obligation, you could have the greatest agency in the world. They're not going to be successful. So take a moment and make sure you understand from their perspective what it means to be a good client. All right, listen up, CMOs. If you don't know the answers to these questions, you better figure this out ASAP. If you do not make the most of your honeymoon period, unfortunately, you're going to regret it. So listen to what Mark is telling you today. Really think about these things in detail and be methodical in your approach. All right, we're going to take one more break here, and this is the SBI Podcast. Stick around after the break.
Making your number is hard. Your problems are complex. Complex problems need complex solutions. Introducing the SBI Magazine. Read in-depth stories written by award-winning journalists about how your peers have overcome their problems to make the numbers. When you need more than a tweet, social post, or blog article, turn to the SBI Magazine. Go to salesbenchmarkindex.com to subscribe.
Welcome back. My name is Greg Alexander, and I'm the CEO of SBI. My guest today is Mark Roberts, the CMO of ShoreTel. Today we are discussing critical success factors for new CMOs. In segment 1 of the show, we discussed branding, campaigns, budgeting, and analytics. And in segment 2, we spoke about reorganizing the marketing team and working with agencies. This is our last segment of this show, so let's offer the audience some advice on how to use what they learned today. So Mark, try and summarize what we discussed today into 3 actions an audience member can take immediately to make the most of their honeymoon period.
Sure. Number 1 would be what you've negotiated on the way in is probably everything you're going to get. So think about that very, very carefully. You're not going to be able to go back and redefine your honeymoon period. So you define it before you start the job. Make sure that that's well understood and you understand what you're getting yourself into. The second would be defining what the expectations are with the team that you're looking at. Not every one of those that are in the room that you're going through that experience with are going to take the journey with you. That's okay. But making sure that there's a clear definition of where you think you're going to go and what your expectations are of the team, behavior, culture, etc. Get that done early and get it up front. And the third was decide what your ruthless priorities are. And by a ruthless priority, I mean you can only have like 2 or 3 of these things, no more. If you do any more, you're just going to dilute your efforts. And when there's a few things to do during the day and you're trying to focus down on which one to do because people are going to be pulling you in many, many different directions, just take a look at where true north is. Take a look at your ruthless priorities. And if it's not one of those activities, think twice about whether you should do it or not.
Yep.
So negotiate on the way in, define the expectations, and execute on your ruthless priorities.
Yeah, I love the term ruthless priorities. That's fantastic. So excellent takeaway value. Let me offer my audience my 2 cents. So Mr. or Miss newly hired CMO, you absolutely, positively cannot blow your honeymoon period. I opened the show by revealing that 1/4 of B2B companies have a CMO who has been on the job for 1 year or less. Ask yourself, why is this? I'll tell you why. Too many CMOs blow their honeymoon period and CEOs are trigger happy. Right or wrong, we live in an instant gratification world, and you better make progress and fast, or back into the job market you go. This is why you care. So if you find yourself in a new job, learn from Mark's experience and make the most of your honeymoon period. If you want to make sure you get this right, consider having one of our experts help you with this, for it's not as easy as you might think. If this is of interest to you, go to salesbenchmarkindex.com/contact, and we will send an expert out to see you. Mark, on behalf of my audience, thanks for letting me interview you today.
You're welcome, and thanks, Greg.
Okay. I also want to thank the audience for tuning in. This show has become the most listened to show of its kind, and because of this popularity, we secure great guests like the one we had today. Keep watching and listening, and tell all your friends about it, and thanks again for your support. Until next time, I wish you good luck as you try to make your number.
This has been the SBI Podcast. For more information on SBI services, case studies, the SBI team and how we work, or to subscribe to our other offerings, please visit us at salesbenchmarkindex.com.